My wife went to the luxury company party with me and left with another man, as if I wasn't there, as if our marriage were disposable. I ran after her, still stunned, and found her laughing with him in the parking lot. "You just destroyed what was left between us," was all I could say before announcing the divorce right then and there. She tried to call me days later, saying it was a mistake, that it wasn't anything serious. But her lover disappeared, leaving only the bitter taste of the wrong choice. I suffered, but I was reborn. I met a new woman, someone who truly sees me, with whom I built respect and peace. When she returned to apologize, I listened calmly. I forgave so that neither of us would carry the burden, but not so that we could go back. The end was real, and so was the new beginning. Each of us followed our own path, as it should be. It's strange how the world can turn completely in one night, how the life built over years can slip away in seconds, as if everything said, promised, lived, was just a fleeting illusion. Nothing prepared me for that night. No previous fight, no prolonged silence, no apparent distance. There was wear and tear, of course, as in every marriage that has endured years of routine, frustrated expectations, and silences that hurt more than screams, but I believed we were surviving. I believed that, deep down, there was something to be salvaged. She held my hand as we entered the ballroom, posed for photos beside me, smiled at her colleagues, clinked glasses, complimented the buffet. And I watched her as always, with silent admiration, with a love that weathered the storm, even though the boat had long since been taking on water. But she was no longer there. She was no longer mine. I remember the moment I realized something was wrong. She released my hand lightly, as if she were just going to the bathroom or to greet someone across the room. But she didn't come back. Minutes turned into almost an hour, and when I found her again, she didn't seem lost or busy, she seemed happy. She was laughing like a teenager, with a sparkle in her eyes I hadn't seen in months. And it wasn't with me. It was with him. A man I'd never seen, but who, somehow, seemed to have been in her life for much longer than I could have imagined. She didn't even notice me arriving. Or she did, and pretended not to. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the brazenness. The public disrespect. The certainty in her eyes that I was nothing anymore. That my love, my dedication, my effort, were irrelevant. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to find some rational explanation for it, some justification that would soften the blow. A joke? A provocation? An attempt to make me jealous? But there was no drama there. It was real. They looked at each other as if they were starting something, and what I saw was the end. I followed them to the parking lot. My heart felt like it was pounding in my stomach. My hands were shaking. I didn't know whether to scream, cry, beg, or simply turn away. She was laughing loudly when I approached. He was leaning against the car, she was beside him, and they both seemed to have forgotten I existed. When she saw me, her eyes widened for a second, not with guilt, but with surprise. As if my being there bothered her, as if I were in the way. "You just destroyed what was left between us," was all that came out of my mouth. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just looked at her and, in the strongest voice I could find amidst the chaos, announced, "I'm leaving you. Here. Now." And I turned away. In the days that followed, she tried to call me. She sent long messages, some short. Some aggressive, some tearful. It was a mistake, she said. It wasn't serious. But it was serious enough for her to go out with me and then go off with someone else. It was serious enough for her to tear up years of history like wrapping paper. It was serious enough for her to kill me inside while laughing alongside another man. And then the silence came. That man was gone. Disappeared like smoke. No call, no explanation. Just abandonment. Just emptiness. She was left alone, and I was shattered. There were nights when I wondered if I'd done everything right. If I'd loved too much. If I'd failed to set boundaries. If I was the problem. If she'd felt invisible. If I'd made her stop believing in love. But it didn't take long to understand that no, the problem wasn't my love, it was hers that had run out. Or maybe it never existed the way I thought. And then, little by little, something in me began to be reborn. It wasn't quick. It wasn't easy. But it was real. I rebuilt myself silently, piece by piece, until I looked in the mirror and recognized myself again. I met a different woman. A kind of person who doesn't choose you only when it suits her, but who chooses to stay even on the days when you're not easy to love. With her, I found respect, listening, lightness. She didn't ask me for proof, didn't play games, didn't threaten to leave at every slip-up. She was simply there. And I allowed myself to be there too. It was at this point in my life, when I was whole again, that my ex-wife reappeared. With downcast eyes, a trembling voice, and genuine regret. "I don't know what came over me," she whispered. "I lost myself. I thought I was looking for something better, but I realized the best was what I already had." She cried. She apologized. She said she just wanted to talk, that she needed my peace to move on. And I listened to everything. Calmly. Maturely. I forgave. Because forgiveness, sometimes, is more for us than for the other. But I didn't go back. And she understood that right then and there. That the end was real. And that the new beginning wouldn't be with her. But life, with its irony and surgical precision, still had something in store for her. Something that would make everything she sought out there seem ridiculous. Something that would bring her face to face with the pain she herself had sown, and which was now blooming again, but in a different garden. It wasn't about revenge. It was about emotional justice. About consequences. About finally seeing the value of what she had thrown away. Months later, when we were all going our separate ways, she met my gaze again. No longer that passionate, hopeful gaze, begging to be seen. But a calm, steady, complete gaze. The gaze of someone who had survived war and emerged stronger. A gaze that, now, was directed at another woman. And it was in that moment, the very instant our eyes met and she saw the way I looked at her, that she understood everything. The gaze she thought she could win back at any moment, now belonged to someone else. She smiled in pain. She tried to hide it. But I saw it. I saw the tremble in her lip, the regret in her eyes, the sigh in her breath. And, deep inside, I knew, she had lost. Not by punishment. Not by bad luck. But by choice. For believing that true love is replaceable. For exchanging an entire heart for an empty promise. She discovered, too late, that those who truly love, when they leave, don't return the same. If they do, it's no longer out of love. And sometimes, they don't even return at all. But what exactly did she see there, that day, that made her understand so clearly the extent of her loss? What was it that finally made her cry, not out of guilt, but out of the absence of what she would never have again? That is the part of the story that still needs to be told. Welcome to the channel. Here, no form of betrayal is romanticized or defended, on the contrary. All the stories you will hear are fictions based on real situations, created to show, with intensity and emotion, how betrayal corrodes relationships, destroys lives and leaves deep scars. The objective is clear: show that cheating is not just a mistake, it is a choice with irreversible consequences. Get ready. Today's story will move you. Feel, reflect, and never forget, true love does not deserve to be discarded. His name was Daniel, and she was Clara. Two simple, common, memorable names, just like their relationship seemed to be at first. There was no excess, no shouting, no surprises. Everything seemed light, like a leisurely Sunday, like a hot coffee on a cold morning, like a silent embrace after a hard day. They met by chance at a get-together between mutual friends, almost 7 years ago. He was reserved, attentive, observant. She was expansive, charming, possessing a natural elegance that blended firmness and sensitivity in the same gaze. It was hard not to be attracted to Clara, but what truly captivated was the way she seemed present in every conversation, as if paying attention not only to the words, but also to what was unsaid. Daniel fell in love quickly, though he only admitted it much later. Clara took a little longer, liking to test her feelings before giving them all. But when she did, she dove in deeply. The two created their own world within their relationship, where small routines became symbols of affection. A note stuck on the fridge, a playlist made just for her, the habit of cooking together on Saturdays. There was a kind of kindness between them that was rare. They respected silences, laughed at the same silly things, and, above all, cared for each other. The beginning was fertile ground for enchantment, the kind of love we believe can last forever. The wedding came after 2 years of dating. Nothing extravagant, nothing grand. Just what was necessary to celebrate with the people who mattered. They chose to live in a spacious apartment with large windows and city views, a place that seemed to breathe with them. The decor was done gradually, with joint choices and memories scattered throughout the furniture. Clara was a meticulous person, loving to adjust each room to reflect something of their own. Daniel, more practical, enjoyed seeing how her ideas came to life with charm and subtlety. It was a home full of soul. At first, almost everything seemed to work in perfect harmony. Over time, however, life began to take its toll. Clara was growing professionally at a rapid pace. She was rising in the marketing field and was beginning to stand out at company events, in visibility projects, and in meetings with executives. Daniel, on the other hand, maintained a more stable pace as an engineer. He was excellent at what he did, but without great ambitions. He enjoyed the predictability, the routine, the comfort of knowing where he stood. He was never bothered by her success. He was even proud. But little by little, their schedules began to clash. Bedtime conversations became shorter. Saturday dinners were replaced by corporate invitations, social events, and networking. Clara still said she loved him. And she meant it. But she was tired. Tired of so much predictability. Tired of having to maintain a home while the outside world demanded excellence. Tired of repeating routines. Sometimes, when she arrived home after a glittering event, she felt like she'd passed through a portal of euphoria into silence. Daniel waited for her with affection, but also with a kind of inertia. He didn't fully understand her new world. And she, despite herself, was beginning to no longer want to explain. Despite this, there was still tenderness. There were still kisses in the morning. There were still hand-holdings at Sunday dinners. But their eyes no longer sought each other with the same thirst. They slept in the same bed, but their dreams no longer seemed to align. Daniel understood the changes, but couldn't name them. He thought it was just a phase. That everything would fall into place with time. That all it took was patience, care, and affection. He believed, as many do, that love survives any wear and tear. And in a way, he was right. But what he didn't realize is that sometimes, love doesn't die, it just changes form, slips through our fingers, and begins to inhabit other intentions. Clara, for her part, wasn't cold. Quite the opposite. She was too intense. She wanted to feel everything deeply. And perhaps that's why he began to suffocate. She began to question whether Daniel's love was still enough. If that good, safe, kind life was all she wanted. Sometimes she looked in the mirror and felt faded. Beautiful, yes, but faded. As if she had become a functional version of herself, adapted to routine, tamed by time. He began to spend more time away. He accepted invitations he had previously declined. He sought to reconnect with parts of himself he thought had been forgotten. The distance grew subtly. There were no violent fights, no open betrayals, no outbursts. Everything was quiet, silent, almost imperceptible. The kind of weariness that sets in like a slow poison. Daniel, even without understanding what was happening, tried to resist. He began organizing small moments together. He planned a short trip, revived old habits, tried to recapture music, movies, gestures. But Clara was already in a different time. She still smiled, still said, "I love you," but her gaze was often elsewhere. As if searching for something he couldn't offer. As if she longed to be seen differently. He felt it, but didn't understand. And this disconnect began to weigh heavily. Despite everything, the two still respected each other. They still shared a bond in the little things, in financial decisions, household chores, and concern for each other's health. But emotionally, they were no longer together. Clara seemed to want more than stability. She wanted passion. She wanted something that would take her breath away. And Daniel, without realizing it, continued to offer her a safe haven when she longed for a storm. He was shelter. And she, at that stage in her life, wanted to throw herself into the wind. Then came the invitations to company parties, dinners with colleagues, and short business trips. Clara became more involved in that world, with people who seemed to understand her thirst for novelty, her hunger for experiences. Daniel remained on the sidelines, respecting her space, believing it was all part of her professional growth. He was never possessive, never doubtful. He had an almost naive trust. He believed their love was strong enough to endure anything. And perhaps it was, if they both were willing to keep fighting for it. But something was no longer there. The kisses became formal. The conversations, more informative than affectionate. The hands that once sought each other spontaneously now touched more out of habit than desire. They still slept together, but the silence between them grew increasingly loud. They still said they loved each other, but they seemed to be repeating a memorized, unlived phrase. And then, an invitation came. A luxury party at the company where Clara worked. Daniel didn't like these environments, but she insisted he go. She wanted, perhaps, to show that they were still a couple. Or, perhaps, to confirm to herself that they weren't anymore. They arrived together, side by side, with practiced smiles. Daniel watched Clara shine among her peers, fluent in her subjects, elegant in her gestures, impeccable in her posture. It was clear how much she was admired in that environment. He watched her with pride, but also with a certain distance. As if she were becoming a person he no longer knew. And yet, he loved her. Even in doubt, even in the shadow of what they were becoming, he still believed. Clara, for her part, was torn inside. She wanted Daniel to be more present, more involved, more attentive to her transformations. But she also didn't know if she wanted him to be who he was or someone new. There was a restlessness she couldn't name, a hole in her chest that wasn't filled by praise or achievements. It was an emotional void, a feeling of being disconnected from her own destiny. That night, many social masks were worn. Many polite smiles. Many obligatory gestures of affection. But something was about to happen. Something that would completely change the trajectory of those two. Something that, once done, would be irreversible. What seemed like just another ordinary event in their lives would become the breaking point. It wouldn't be a sudden scandal, but a sequence of decisions, small, almost imperceptible, that would ultimately transform Daniel and Clara's story. And there, in the hall lit by luxurious chandeliers, amid toasts, side conversations, and appearances maintained, what was about to happen would leave its mark forever. What happened after that night? What exactly turned their love into ruin and longing? What did Clara see, or not see, in that marriage that changed the course of her own story? And what kind of pain would Daniel still have to endure before he could find some peace again? The answer, as painful as it is necessary, lies in what is yet to come. The night of the party arrived shrouded in an almost cinematic atmosphere. Clara had spent hours getting ready, and there was a sparkle in her eyes Daniel hadn't seen in ages, but he interpreted it as excitement. She emerged from the bedroom doorway wearing a dress that seemed molded to her body, a new perfume he didn't recognize, light but striking makeup, and a confidence that bordered on disdain. He complimented her, tried to create some kind of intimacy in that moment, but she merely thanked him with a vague, distracted smile. On the way to the venue, they chatted about trivialities, traffic, music, last week's wine. Daniel forced lightness, but he felt something strange, an invisible tension, as if Clara were there and, at the same time, miles away. He tried to ignore it, as he had been doing for weeks, maybe months. After all, he didn't want to be that insecure, controlling, insistent man. He preferred to believe in the solidity of what they had built. Even if it was now subtly and silently crumbling. The hall was grand, lit by a circular chandelier that cast golden reflections on the floor. Important figures circulated with glasses in hand and calculated smiles. Clara moved with ease, greeting colleagues with long hugs, firm handshakes, and lingering glances. She was an admired woman, and Daniel, even uncomfortable with so much attention focused on her, remained respectfully at her side, trying to be part of a world that was not his own. He felt out of place, yet present. He observed Clara's gestures, the way she bowed slightly when speaking, how she smiled more with her eyes than with her lips, how she seemed to lose herself in certain exchanges that lasted too long. At times, she introduced him, but always in a formal manner. "My husband," she said, without enthusiasm, almost as if it were an obligation. Those words, spoken without intention, hurt more than the silence. The hours passed slowly. Daniel drank slowly, moving among people who talked too much and listened too little. At one point, he stepped away to get some water, and when he returned, Clara was no longer where he'd left her. He searched with his eyes, in vain. He walked among the groups, feigning naturalness, but felt a growing unease. His heart raced with an uneasiness he couldn't explain. It was as if something was about to happen. Something already in motion, but which he couldn't yet see. She climbed a side staircase in search of fresh air, stopped on the upper floor balcony, and stood there for a few minutes. When she returned, she noticed that Clara had not yet reappeared. She began searching more intently, walking down the hallways, looking everywhere, without success. And then, in the hallway leading to the restrooms, she saw a strange movement. Someone was leaving, laughing with her, both of them walking quickly, looking around. Clara didn't even notice her presence. Or she did, but she didn't care. She was focused on the man beside her, an unfamiliar face, well-dressed, with a confident air. He touched her arm intimately, and she returned it with a knowing smile. The scene lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to make Daniel's stomach churn with nausea. He stood there, watching his own life slip away like sand through his fingers. He decided to do nothing. Not there. Not then. He swallowed hard, turned away, and tried to compose himself. He knew he couldn't explode. He knew he needed to understand what he was seeing first. He spent another hour feigning normalcy, smiling at strangers, answering questions he didn't want to hear, clutching his glass so tightly he nearly broke it. And when he could bear it no longer, he went to the parking lot, imagining he might find Clara in the car or already waiting for a driver. But what he saw was something no man should ever have to see. She was leaning against the side of a black car, laughing with the same man. His hands touched her hips familiarly, and she showed no sign of discomfort. On the contrary, she leaned into him as if seeking shelter. Daniel approached without thinking, overcome by a force even he couldn't explain. When he realized it, he was already standing in front of them. Clara saw him and froze. Her smile faded, her eyes widened, and for a moment, silence fell like a lightning bolt. The man beside her simply recoiled, confused. Daniel took a deep breath and said, in the calmest voice in the world, yet filled with pain, "You just destroyed what was left between us." And without waiting for an answer, he turned and walked away. In that moment, something broke forever. Clara tried to chase him, but he wouldn't listen. She tried to talk, to justify himself, but he was no longer there. The next morning, she tried calling, texting, asking to talk. She said it was nothing, that she was confused, that she didn't know what she was doing. Daniel read it all with empty eyes. The words no longer held weight. The promises seemed recycled. Nothing seemed worthy of a response. In the days that followed, Clara kept trying. She called mutual friends, tried to contact his family, went to his apartment building. Nothing worked. He had already begun mourning a marriage that, in truth, had been dead for a long time. That night was just the final stretch. The silent signature at the end of the story. But Clara didn't give up so easily. She began writing long messages, filled with regret. She said she didn't know what she was looking for that night, that she was swept away by a sense of freedom, a momentary need, an emotional breakdown. She said she still loved him, that she didn't want to lose him, that it was all a mistake. But nothing she said was enough. Daniel, even devastated, could no longer see the woman he had loved. The one who was with him on lazy Sundays, on impromptu trips, on birthdays filled with affection. The Clara he knew no longer existed. Or perhaps, she never existed in the way he believed. And that was an even greater pain. Deep down, what hurt him most wasn't the betrayal itself, but the coldness with which she allowed herself to live that moment, as if he were invisible, as if they hadn't shared a life, as if he didn't matter. And that was what destroyed any possibility of return. Trust, once broken, can't be rebuilt with words. It takes time, actions, genuine repentance. And Daniel no longer had the will to do that. He no longer wanted to start over something that had clearly fallen apart. He decided to move on. Alone. In pain, but also with dignity. However, there was something Clara didn't yet know. Something that would make everything even more irreversible. A detail, a piece of information, a revelation that was about to come to light, and that would forever change the way she viewed that night. Because sometimes, the greatest punishment isn't being left. It's discovering that, when you finally want to return, the other person has already left completely. And what she would see shortly after would make her understand, with brutal clarity, the enormity of the mistake she had made. On that gray, seemingly ordinary Saturday morning, Clara showed up unexpectedly. The intercom rang before 9, and Daniel, still limp from a restless sleep, answered without thinking. He recognized her voice immediately. Hers, hesitant, trembling, as if unsure of what she was doing there. She simply said she needed to talk. He was slow to respond. Not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. Weeks had passed since the breakup, and in that time, she'd persisted with words, promises, attempts at explanations that all rang hollow. But in that moment, there was something different in her tone. Something he couldn't quite name, but which convinced him to let her in. When she appeared before him, her eyes were puffy, her makeup gone, her hair tied up haphazardly. It was the rawest version of herself he'd ever seen. And perhaps, for that very reason, the truest. Clara entered with uncertain steps and stopped in the center of the room as if unsure where to begin. He didn't invite her to sit, didn't offer coffee, or make room for formalities. He simply crossed his arms and waited. She looked around, recognizing every corner, every detail of the house that still smelled of her, but now belonged to another energy, an energy no longer hers. When she finally spoke, her voice came out almost like a whisper, but with the strength of someone who had been holding something bottled up for a long time. She said what she had done was unforgivable, that she knew it, that she didn't expect understanding or a second chance, but that she needed to tell him something. Something he deserved to know. Daniel remained silent, but his body stiffened. His breathing slowed as if bracing his lungs for a blow. Clara, without looking him directly, began to talk about the party. Not about what he saw, but about what she felt. About the momentary freedom she mistook for happiness, about the illusion of being desired by someone new, about the wounded pride that led her to that impulsive act. But it wasn't regret she wanted to talk about. It was something else. She swallowed hard, took a deep breath, and finally looked him in the eye. She revealed that, on the night of the party, the man she left with, the same one who laughed with her in the parking lot, who lured her with false promises of something different, wasn't just some random stranger. She said he'd actually been in her life for months. Not as a lover, not as a friend, but as a figure camouflaged in her routine, someone who had been quietly approaching, gaining ground, not through seduction, but through listening. He was a new manager in the company's events department, discreet, always kind, with an impeccable professional record and a polished delivery. He never forced her into anything. Never provoked her directly. But he slowly infiltrated her, fueling dissatisfactions she herself hadn't known she had. And before she knew it, she felt dependent on his attention, on the look of admiration she no longer found at home. Until it all culminated that night. Daniel listened with his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on her, trying to process every detail. He already knew about the betrayal, but not how persistent it was. He didn't know it had been premeditated, nurtured for weeks, maybe months. And then Clara blurted out what she had kept bottled up until then. She said that 3 days after the divorce was announced, she sought out the man. She called, texted, waited outside work. He disappeared. And the following week, during a meeting with one of the company's executives, she overheard a conversation that shook her to the core. This man wasn't who he claimed to be. He used a false name, a fabricated identity, and had repeated this same pattern at other companies and in other states. He approached women in high-ranking positions, created emotional bonds, and somehow managed to extract strategic information. Then, he disappeared without a trace. The information was hushed up internally, no one wanted to pursue the scandal further for fear of damaging the company's image. But Clara knew she had been used. Not only had her trust as a woman been betrayed, but her trust had been emotionally exposed, manipulated in her most intimate weaknesses. She hadn't just lost her husband. She had lost herself. She realized she had been manipulated, that she had given up years of stability for a fabricated fantasy. And what hurt even more was knowing that Daniel had been right all along, not in the accusations, because he never accused her, but in his attitude of blind trust. And she had broken that trust over something that didn't even exist. Daniel ran his hand over his face and sat on the sofa as if his legs had given out. Everything made more sense now. The way she withdrew emotionally, her rush to find something new, the sparkle in her eyes as she left, the impatience in their conversations. Clara fell silent for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was already filled with desperation. She said she knew there was no going back, that he wasn't the kind of man to lower himself, to ask for explanations, or to beg for something back. But she still needed him to know everything, because even though she regretted it, even though she suffered, what destroyed her most was knowing she'd lost a true love to a well-told lie. She said she woke in the middle of the night wanting to go back in time, to stop herself from leaving that room, to run to him and tell him it was all a mistake before it was too late. But it was too late. Too late. Daniel took a deep breath. And for the first time, he spoke. He asked why she hadn't said this before. Why she'd waited so long to tell him the truth. She replied that she was ashamed. That she didn't want to be seen as weak, as someone who had been deceived, as a victim of herself. He fell silent again, got up slowly, walked to the window, and looked outside as if searching for answers on the horizon. When he looked back at her, there was sadness, but not hatred. There was deep pain, but not anger. He said he forgave, but not forgotten. That he understood, but wouldn't go back. That he was sorry for everything, but that a lack of trust can't be rebuilt with belated revelations. Clara tried to get closer, gently touching his arm, but he backed away. He said he was at peace. That he finally understood everything. And that, even with everything that had happened, he hoped she would find herself again. She cried as if she no longer knew where to store so much guilt. And then, before leaving, she saw something she hadn't seen before. On the living room shelf, a new photo. Daniel, next to a woman she didn't know, smiling in a way he hadn't smiled in years. In the background, a landscape of travel, the sea at dusk. There was lightness in that image, a serene, peaceful happiness, like someone who had finally found rest. She didn't ask who it was. She didn't have the courage. But in that moment, she knew. She walked away in silence. And as she crossed the street, she felt for the first time the true weight of the word loss. It was no longer a hypothesis, a doubt, a risk. It was a fact. She had lost the love of her life by choice. By seeking outside what she hadn't known how to cultivate within. And now, there was no going back. There was no time. All that remained was regret, and the memory of his gaze that day, full of love, when everything could still be saved. That gaze that was no longer hers. And would never be again. Clara spent the days following that conversation shrouded in a silence that hurt more than any cursed word. After leaving Daniel's apartment, she felt the city change color, as if everything had taken on a dull, lifeless, warmthless tone. The street noises no longer distracted her, her phone no longer vibrated with notifications, and even among colleagues or friends, there was a chasm no one could bridge. What she hadn't wanted to see before, the emotional absence, the end of the bond, was now present in every gesture of her daily life. Her home felt like a strange place, and even the mirrors seemed to reflect the image of a woman she no longer recognized. Her face was tired, her eyes were aimless, her soul was wounded. For the first time, Clara was truly alone. Not the social loneliness, but the loneliness that comes when you lose the person you knew down to their deepest silences. Unable to work, he took a few days off. He could no longer bear to sit in front of the screen and feign concentration, as if life could go on ignoring the hole that had opened in his chest. He withdrew from commitments, declined invitations, avoided talking about what had happened. Deep down, he knew he was reaping what he had sown. But no matter how much he acknowledged his mistake, no matter how much he accepted responsibility, it didn't lessen the suffering. On the contrary, it intensified it. The clarity of regret was a knife stuck in his throat every day, slowly turning. Because it wasn't just the loss of Daniel that hurt, it was the way it all happened, how much she had allowed a stranger to occupy a space that should never have been given. The image of the new woman beside him wouldn't leave her mind. Not just out of jealousy, but because of the realization of what he had become. Daniel had transformed into someone she'd never been able to allow to emerge, someone light, spontaneous, full of light. And seeing this new look in his eyes made her realize how much she'd confined that man to a role, while searching outside for something he'd perhaps been hiding all along. She thought he was predictable, calm, unchanging. But the truth was, he simply wasn't revealing himself completely to her. And this realization was brutal. Not out of pride, but because she understood that the problem wasn't him. It was the way she saw him. Unsure how to process everything, Clara decided to visit her sister, Mariana, with whom she hadn't spoken in months. Their relationship was marked by ups and downs, but there was always a bond that endured the distance. When she arrived, Mariana greeted her with surprise, but didn't hesitate to open the door. They spoke little at first, as if measuring the space between them. Until Clara broke down. She told her everything, the party, the man, the betrayal, the pain, the end, the regret. Mariana listened quietly, without judgment, but with a look in her eyes that would later become disconcerting. When Clara finished, she expected a hug, a word of comfort, a phrase that would bring relief, even if only for a few minutes. But Mariana remained silent for a few seconds and then blurted out, with an almost cruel calm, that she already knew everything. She said she learned of the betrayal the day after the party, when Daniel sought her out, desperate, wanting to understand, wanting answers that Clara couldn't or wouldn't give. She said they spent hours talking that morning, and that for the first time, she saw in him a pain she couldn't name. Mariana revealed that day, she realized Daniel was broken, but still hadn't spoken ill of Clara. That at no point had he tried to tarnish her image, that he hadn't screamed, or cried. He simply asked, with broken eyes, if she, Clara's sister, could understand her. Mariana didn't answer at the time. But that image scarred her. And since then, she began to see him differently. Clara was shocked. Not by the conversation, but because she sensed something more in her sister's tone. An admiration that went beyond empathy. A veiled tenderness. She asked, her voice dry, if she and Daniel had kept in touch after that. Mariana hesitated, which was enough. The silence said more than any words. Clara stood, walked to the window, and stared at the horizon as if she could escape it. Mariana tried to explain, saying there was nothing between them, that they'd only met a few times by chance, that they'd exchanged messages, yes, but never crossed the line. That she would never do that to her sister. But Clara knew. She felt it. There was something there. Something that was forming. And that, sooner or later, would turn into something more. Because Daniel was the kind of man who, when he became transparent, won her over with his very being. And Mariana was seeing what she herself had been unable to see. She left her sister's house without saying goodbye. He returned to the apartment and sank onto the couch as if he wanted to disappear. It all felt like a cruel punishment. Her betrayal had left her completely vulnerable. And now, she risked seeing the man she still loved, yes, she loved him, fall in love with the closest person she had left. She felt empty, replaced, unimportant. But more than that, she felt permanently replaced. Daniel had moved on. And she was still. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Daniel walked steadily through a Sunday market. Beside him, Laura, the woman in the photo, the one Clara had seen on the shelf, held his hand lightly. There were discreet smiles, knowing glances, conversations that flowed effortlessly. She demanded nothing of him. She didn't ask for proof. She simply was. Present, attentive, whole. And he, who had spent so much time trying to repair a relationship where he was always less, now found himself loved completely. Laura knew his story, not in detail, but with the depth of someone who listens with their heart. She knew the pain he brought, the disappointment, the struggle to move on. And she respected that. She didn't invade. She waited. And Daniel allowed himself to. Little by little, he relearned what it was like to be with someone without needing to beg for affection. One afternoon, while they were walking together through a bookstore, Laura found an old copy of an author Daniel liked. She laughed and said, almost teasingly, that the book was for him, a reminder that even the saddest stories deserve a new page. Daniel smiled, took the book, and kissed her. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment, he knew he was ready to move on. And when he looked into her eyes, he saw peace. Not euphoria, not obsession, not urgency. He saw peace. And that was all he needed. Days later, Clara received a notification on her phone. It was a story from Laura. Nothing explicit. Just an image of hands clasped on a table, 2 glasses of wine in the background, and the caption, "It's about this." She recognized his hand immediately. That curve of his finger, the discreet bracelet on his left wrist, the way he held it tightly without squeezing. Clara's heart raced, but not with hope. It was something else. The acceptance that she had now become a spectator in his life. That, where she had once been the protagonist, she was now just a memory. And what hurt most wasn't that he had moved on. It was knowing he had found someone better, not in the sense of superiority, but in the sense of belonging. He found love where he didn't have to fight to be seen. And she, who had had him for years, didn't know how to see it until it was too late. The following week, Clara returned to Mariana's house. But not to confront her. She wanted to tell her that, despite everything, she forgave her. Not out of moral high ground, but because holding on to resentment would only make it hurt even more. She said she didn't understand, but respected it. And that if fate brought them together, she wouldn't be an obstacle. Mariana cried, apologized 1,000 times, but Clara simply hugged her and left. There was no more war there. Just a silent pain, which in time, she knew, would become a scar. Meanwhile, Daniel, now completely silent about the past, made plans. He had relearned to enjoy late afternoons, movies on the couch, cooking with someone. And even though the memory of Clara still surfaced occasionally like a ghost, it no longer hurt as much as before. It was a memory. Sad, yes, but overcome. Because, in the end, true love doesn't die because of betrayal, it transforms. And sometimes, it's reborn somewhere else. Calmer. Simpler. More sincere. The days following Clara and Mariana's reunion didn't bring immediate relief, but they opened a crack where, for the first time in a long time, lucidity could penetrate. Clara began to see that what remained for her was no longer the mourning of a marriage ending, but the need to rebuild herself as a woman outside of that story. And this realization hurt almost physically. It was as if she were losing for the second time not only Daniel, but also all the versions of herself she had abandoned throughout the relationship. Not because of his choices, but because of her own. Every step away from reality, every time she allowed herself to harbor an illusion, every moment she believed she could have everything without taking responsibility for anything, now exacted a heavy price. The freedom she thought she wanted proved to be an abyss. And at the bottom of that void, she had to face herself, without excuses, without deflecting blame, without alternative narratives to hide behind. For the first time, Clara saw herself whole, and she didn't like what she saw. He began to seek therapy more seriously. Before, it was something I did sporadically, like someone who kept a schedule. Now, she truly sat down, faced the silences, let the tears come as they came, and for the first time, listened to what was behind her own voice. The therapist made her reflect on how, throughout her life, Clara had grown accustomed to wishing for things that seemed out of reach, not because they were better, but because they represented an escape from herself. And perhaps because of this, even with a man like Daniel by her side, constant, loving, present, she still felt the need to cross the line and seek, outside, something to distract her from her own emptiness. Realizing this was like ripping off her skin. But it was also liberating. While Clara immersed herself in her reconstruction, Daniel experienced a different moment, not of escape, but of settlement. For the first time in years, he could plan his life without feeling like he was walking on quicksand. With Laura, the days were simple and, precisely for that reason, extraordinary. She didn't blame him for unresolved pasts, but she also didn't turn a blind eye to the scars he still carried. On the contrary, she welcomed each pain as someone who understands that loving someone also means knowing that the other has suffered. But not everything was easy. There were, yes, moments when the shadow of the old relationship would emerge in small details, a song playing in a cafe, an unintentionally repeated expression, a corner where Clara had once walked with him. At these times, Daniel would fall silent, take a deep breath, and let it pass. Not out of indifference, but because he had learned that not all pain needs to be explained, some just need to be felt until they disappear on their own. It was in this scenario of silent advances that Laura, on an ordinary afternoon, asked if he felt ready to talk about what he'd experienced. There was no pressure in her tone. It was simply an open question, a door ajar for whenever he wanted to walk through it. Daniel hesitated. And then he told her, with long pauses, without drama, without exaggeration. He said he loved Clara deeply, that he believed in her until the end, that he tried to hold on to her even when she was already slipping from his grasp. He said the betrayal tore him apart, but what destroyed him most was the fact that she hadn't hesitated. That the way she ignored him that night was the final blow. Laura listened in silence. When he finished, she simply hugged him. Not to console, but to say, without words, that his time was now different. Clara, on the other side of life, had made a decision that weighed heavily on her chest. She needed to get rid of the symbols that connected her to Daniel. Not out of anger, but because she knew that as long as she held on to the memories like relics, she would never be able to move on. He gathered photos, letters, gifts, travelogues, and put them all in a box. But instead of throwing them away, he decided to write a letter. Not to give them away. Just to get it out. He wrote everything he'd never said out loud. He admitted his mistakes, thanked everyone for everything he'd experienced, and asked for forgiveness not for individual actions, but for the way he'd allowed himself to fade away within the relationship. And at the end of the letter, he wrote the phrase that echoed in his head every day, "You loved me like no one else, and I only realized it when it was no longer possible to love you back." Then he put the box in the back of the closet, knowing that one day, perhaps, he'd have the courage to destroy it. But it wasn't time yet. Shortly thereafter, a mutual friend of theirs, an old college classmate who had drifted apart over time, but who maintained sporadic contact with both, organized a reunion dinner. Clara learned Daniel would be there. She considered refusing. But she decided to go. Not to confront, nor to insist. Just to be there, among people who had been part of her story. She arrived early, dressed discreetly, and made no plans. When Daniel entered, accompanied by Laura, the air seemed to hang for a few seconds. She saw them from afar, and her heart raced, but she stood her ground. Laura recognized her from the description he had surely given, and her look wasn't provocative or superior, it was respectful. The kind of respect only those with inner security can offer. During the evening, Clara and Daniel crossed paths once, next to the drinks table. He was cordial. She was reserved. They exchanged brief greetings and a long look. There was no more hurt there. But there was pain. Not the pain of anger, but the pain of what had been wasted. When she returned home that night, she didn't cry. She simply sat on the porch and gazed at the sky. The same sky they had admired together so many times. She felt that, finally, a part of her had closed. And it hurt less than she imagined. Maybe because she had already accepted it. Or maybe because, deep down, she knew that their reunion was the last page of a chapter that needed to be closed once and for all. A few weeks later, Clara received a message from Mariana. An invitation. She said she was engaged. And that she wanted her to come to the announcement dinner. It took Clara days to respond. But she accepted. At dinner, she saw that Mariana was with someone other than Daniel. It was another man, someone simple, calm-looking, different. Mariana pulled her aside and explained. She said that, despite the emotional connection she had with Daniel at that delicate moment, they both decided not to pursue it further. They realized there was affection, but not love. And that what they had experienced served only to heal wounds, not to start a new story. Clara listened with restrained relief. Not because she still had hope for Daniel, but because now there were no more loose ends. That story, finally, was completely wrapped up. No turning back. No doubts. No questions asked. The next night, Clara walked alone down a quiet street, listening to an old song she and Daniel used to listen to together. For the first time, she smiled as she remembered. Not with melancholy, but with tenderness. There was no more pain in remembering. Only gratitude. Life had moved on. She was learning to enjoy her own company, to relearn how to view herself with less judgment, to rebuild what had been broken not by anyone, but by herself. And this rebuilding hurt, but it was necessary. She was learning to be whole again, not by anyone, but by herself. Daniel, for his part, had traveled with Laura that same weekend. It was a simple place, in the countryside, where the days passed slowly and the silences didn't need filling. On the inn's porch, as they sipped wine and gazed at the horizon, he realized that peace doesn't come when everything is right, but when we learn to live with what didn't work out. When he understood this, he knew he was finally free. Not from Clara, but from everything that bound him to the version of himself he had accepted for fear of losing. And now, he was no longer afraid. Their story was over. But not a failure. Because in love, sometimes the lesson lies precisely at the end. The weeks passed as if time were slowly wiping away the remnants of a story that no longer required return, but rather understanding. Clara began to engage in activities she had abandoned for years. She returned to painting, something she had passionately pursued in her youth and which, during her marriage, had become lost in deadlines, goals, and obligations. There was something deeply symbolic about getting her hands dirty with paint again, creating shapes, layers, and colors that conveyed feelings she herself couldn't put into words. Her first canvases were confusing, heavy, almost somber, as if she were trying to vomit all the pent-up pain. But over time, the lines became lighter, the tones brighter, and the images began to take on an identity that surprised even Clara herself. It was as if, little by little, she was relearning to feel something without necessarily being tied to someone else's presence. At the same time, she began attending an art therapy group, where she met different people, stories of new beginnings that somehow resonated with her own. A widower who rediscovered the joy of life through wood carving. A recently divorced young woman reconnecting with dance after years of emotional dependence. A middle-aged woman facing double grief, from her mother and her husband, and who now found in ceramics a way to give form to her own pain. Clara listened, shared, and was moved. And, without realizing it, she began to become someone who inspired others as well. Not because she was an example of overcoming adversity, but because she showed herself without masks. She told her story truthfully, without trying to justify herself. And in this process, she began to free herself. On a rainy afternoon, after one of the group sessions, Clara sat in a small, quiet cafe downtown. The place was new to her, but it felt familiar. The kind of place Daniel would love, he thought. She smiled at the memory, not with pain, but with the kindness of someone who carries another person within them, even when they no longer occupy a place in their life. She ordered a tea, took a notebook from her bag, and began to write. She had done this before, but this time it wasn't a letter to anyone. It was to herself. A logbook of a woman who had betrayed herself before betraying anyone. She wrote about her choices, about the weight of not knowing what you want, about the courage to take responsibility without victimizing herself. And she wrote, for the first time, about the fear of loving again. Because, deep down, love demands exposure. And she was still healing. On the other side of the story, Daniel was experiencing an almost opposite, yet equally revealing, experience. After his trip with Laura, he decided to move apartments. Not because the old one held too many memories, but because he felt that chapter needed to be closed with a symbolic gesture. The new space was smaller, but it had a balcony with plants, light walls, and an atmosphere of a new beginning. Laura helped him with the move, but without intruding. He didn't offer to live with them, didn't pressure them to rush anything. He was simply there, naturally, as if he understood that the deepest processes can't be rushed. Between boxes, laughter, and decisions about where to place the paintings, the two strengthened a silent complicity, built slowly but deeply. One random night, while organizing books, Laura found an old notebook of Daniel's. It was a sort of fragmented diary, with short texts, reflections, and even some simple poems. He blushed and tried to take it back, but she gently held it out and asked if she could read an excerpt. He hesitated, then relented. And she read, quietly, a text written early in his marriage to Clara. It spoke of how loving was a beautiful risk. About how truly giving oneself was the greatest act of courage anyone could undertake. Laura finished reading in silence, then looked at him with a slight smile. She simply said that he was still that man. That what happened next didn't erase the truth of who he was, and still was. That night, Daniel didn't sleep right away. He kept thinking about how pain, no matter how much it transforms us, doesn't define us. He remembered the last time he looked into Clara's eyes and realized there was nothing more to say. But he also remembered the first time she told him a secret, her eyes shining when he talked about a personal project, the way she sang softly while washing the dishes. And he understood that loving someone, even if that love is over, doesn't have to be denied. It can be kept like a book you've already read and that, despite no longer being on the main shelf, still has a worthy place on some shelf of memory. Clara, in turn, began painting a new series of paintings, this time inspired by letters that were never sent. She asked the therapy group to each write a letter to someone who had impacted their lives and leave it with her, anonymously. From these letters, she created an exhibition called Silences That Scream. And it was a success. Not necessarily commercial, but emotional. People were moved by the colors, the lines, and the titles of the works. One in particular caught the curator's attention, a nearly all-white painting, with only a gold spot in the lower right corner, titled The Part of Me That Still Believes. When asked about its meaning, Clara simply said it was about hope. But those who looked closely realized that that spot was all that held the rest of the painting together. Months later, with the exhibition already closed, Clara received a letter. It came with no return address, but she recognized the handwriting immediately. It was Daniel's. Short, direct lines, but loaded with meaning. He said he'd heard about the exhibition from a mutual friend, that he'd seen some images online, and that he was touched. He said he hoped she was well, that he recognized the strength within her, and that he hoped she found peace. There was no implicit invitation, no opening to reconnect. It was simply a gesture of consideration. A way of saying, I saw it. And I'm happy for you. Clara cried when she read it. Not because she still wanted him back, but because that letter was living proof that, despite everything, they had managed to preserve the most noble thing between them, respect. And, perhaps, mature affection. The kind that demands neither possession nor presence, but only the certainty that, somewhere, someone who once loved you still wants you to be happy. As she went for a walk that night, Clara noticed the moon was full. She remembered an old conversation she'd had with Daniel, many years ago, on a similar night. He'd said the full moon was beautiful because even though it was full, it still held shadows. And now, she finally understood what he meant. Being complete didn't mean being resolved. It meant accepting that shadows are part of the light. And that life, with its imperfections, can still be beautiful. Clara's next exhibition took place 6 months later, in a larger gallery, this time in an upscale neighborhood. The invitation spread quickly among the city's cultural circles, attracting journalists, artists, critics, and the curious. She was no longer just a woman trying to find herself through art. Now she was recognized as someone who had transformed pain into legitimate expression, vulnerability into aesthetic power, silence into beauty. Her paintings had matured, as had she. The series she called Transparent Scars showed faces in fragments, gazes interrupted by cracks, misshapen bodies surrounded by small golden specks. All the paintings were named after unspoken words. One of them, in the corner of the exhibition, was subtle. Almost invisible to the most hurried eye. Painted in light, almost faded gray tones, there was only a curved line in the center and a name without a surname, Daniel. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't a dedication. It was a farewell whispered in paint. Daniel didn't go to the exhibition. He heard about it from Laura, who, with a restrained smile, said she'd seen the paintings on social media and that they were beautiful. He simply nodded, saying nothing. There was an understanding between them that needed no explanation. They knew where that story began and, even more, knew where it ended. Laura looked at him tenderly on the days when the shadow of the past appeared in his eyes, and he no longer pretended to be invulnerable. He allowed himself to be seen, complete with his marks and his silences. She didn't want to save him. And perhaps because of that, he felt he was finally saved. The relationship between them became something real, deep, and serene. It was different from anything Daniel had ever experienced. Not because it was more intense, but because it didn't depend on storms to be authentic. They decided to live together in a house on the outskirts, surrounded by greenery, with space for a small studio where Laura could write and he could organize his tools and personal projects. Marriage wasn't an ongoing plan. It was merely a possibility, whether it would happen or not, but it no longer defined the solidity of their feelings. The urgency was a thing of the past. Now, everything was a daily choice. Clara, for her part, remained alone. Not out of bitterness, nor for lack of opportunity. But because she understood that being alone didn't mean being empty. She briefly dated an artist she met while curating the new exhibition, but soon realized it wasn't time to share herself with another. She began investing in social causes related to art and the mental health of women going through separation. She taught workshops, gave lectures, and told her story honestly and without victimhood. The women who listened to her saw in her someone who had experienced the worst of herself and still chose to be better. And that was her greatest victory. The relationship with Mariana remained stable, albeit distant. There was affection, there was respect, but the wound, though healed, left a sensitivity that demanded limits. They never spoke of Daniel again. It was a subject they both decided to bury in time. Mariana married the man she met at their engagement dinner. Someone calm, not part of the past. The wedding was small and intimate. Clara didn't attend, but she sent a painting as a gift. An abstract painting in shades of deep blue with white spots in the center. Enclosed was a short note, "Peace makes no noise. May it be your path." Mariana cried when she read it. And there she understood that the love between sisters, though wounded, has a way of enduring that defies logic. Months later, an unexpected event brought everyone back together, albeit briefly. Clara and Mariana's mother suffered a minor domestic accident, but it required hospitalization. The two took turns at the hospital. And, by chance, on one of those days, Daniel also showed up. Not out of obligation, but because, over the years, he had created a genuine bond with that family. They met in the hallway, Clara and he, for a few seconds. It was quick, but genuine. They exchanged a hug. Not one of those formal or awkward ones, but a real hug, full of humanity. They didn't need to say anything. Her eyes said, "Thank you," his answered, "I know." And they moved on. Each returned to their own reality. Each with the certainty that the past, when it finally accepts its place, can stop hurting. At an art event held months later, Clara received an award for the relevance of her work in the emotional reconstruction of women who had experienced abandonment, guilt, and starting over. On stage, her speech was calm but charged with emotion. She said that for a long time she believed pain was a punishment, but that over time she understood that it was just a process. That loving someone also means running the risk of losing yourself. And that forgiving yourself is the only possible path to, one day, loving yourself fully again. She received a standing ovation. And among the applause was an unknown woman, wearing a simple dress and teary eyes, who approached her later and said she had decided not to cheat on her husband after watching an interview with Clara weeks earlier. She said what she heard made her reflect on the price she could pay. And that now she was rebuilding the relationship with truth. Clara hugged her as if hugging herself in the past. And she felt, in that moment, that her story, however painful, had served something greater than herself. Outside, the world went on. Bars were packed on weekends, social media still promoted illusions of perfect relationships, and betrayals continued as usual. But in a corner of the world, 3 people had learned that fidelity isn't just about the body. It's about presence. About emotional honesty. About not abandoning the other while they're still trying to stay. Daniel, now with slightly grayer hair but a calm smile, continued with Laura, building good days. Not always extraordinary. But real. Clara, with her paints and silences, painted not just canvases, but a new way of living. Mariana, with her home under construction, understood the importance of not inheriting the mistakes of the past. This is how this story ends. No promises, no unlikely reunions, no endings that deny what was. Each followed their own path. With scars, yes. But also with dignity. And the great truth behind it all is that betrayal doesn't just destroy a relationship, it destroys the way someone looked at you. It tears apart trust, the foundation, the memory of what was built. And when the other person leaves, even if you regret it, there's no going back to square one. Because sometimes, the starting point no longer exists. If you've made it this far, please comment on what you thought of this story. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more stories like this. Remember, on this channel, we do not support any type of cheating. All stories are fictional and created with the aim of showing the real consequences of this type of choice. Cheating isn't just a mistake, it's a decision. And every decision has consequences. Think carefully before hurting someone you love. Some losses cannot be repaired. And some choices cost you the chance to experience true love. Forever.